The rain in the city was a fine, persistent mist that didn't so much fall as hang in the air, soaking everything slowly and thoroughly. It was the kind of afternoon that felt like evening, with the streetlights blinking on early, their glow smeared into halos on the wet pavement. In a quiet corner, away from the main avenues where tourists hurried under umbrellas, was a small cafe. Its sign, The Daily Grind, was faded but cheerful, and the warm light spilling from its window promised a refuge from the damp chill. Inside, the air was thick with the rich, comforting smells of ground coffee, warm bread, and cinnamon. The space was a pleasant clutter of mismatched wooden tables, books left behind by customers, and a large blackboard menu covered in swirling chalk script. The low hum of conversation and the soft hiss of the espresso machine created a steady, soothing soundtrack. It was the exact opposite of the places he usually found himself in these days. He slipped inside, a tall man in a long, dark wool coat, bringing a gust of the damp, cold air in with him. He moved to a small table in the far corner, his movements weary. He was known to the world as a man who commanded grand stages, whose hands were insured for millions, and whose name Victor Zellner was spoken with reverence in concert halls from Paris to Tokyo. But here, in this simple cafe, he was just a tired man with a headache pressing behind his eyes. Grateful for the shadows, the last month was a blur of identical luxury hotel suites, deafening applause that sounded the same in every city, and the relentless pressure to be perfect. Every note he played was scrutinized, every phrase analyzed. The music, the thing he had loved since he was a boy tapping on his grandmother's keys, had started to feel like a beautifully crafted cage. It was all technique, all polish, all expectation. He longed for a wrong note played with joy. He craved something real as he waited for his coffee. His gaze drifted away from the menu and settled on the cafe's most curious feature. In the opposite corner, near a small fireplace that wasn't lit, stood an old upright piano. It was a homely instrument, its dark wood scuffed and marked with the ghosts of countless coffee rings and elbow rests. The brass of the pedals was worn dull. A small handwritten sign rested on the music stand, leaning slightly to the left. It read in cheerful looping letters, "For our customers' pleasure. Play a tune." A sad, almost ironic smile touched his lips. A pleasure piano. In his world, pianos were priceless, temperamental beasts of polished ebony and steel, kept in climate-controlled rooms, touched only by technicians with white gloves. This one looked like it had lived a life. He could imagine students practicing clumsy scales on it, friends gathering around for drunken sing-alongs late at night, children banging on the keys with sticky fingers. It was an instrument of life, not just of art. The thought was strangely appealing. His coffee arrived, a simple black espresso in a heavy white cup. As he took his first sip, savoring the bitter warmth, movement by the piano caught his eye. A woman approached it. She wasn't a customer settling in to play. She wore a simple cream-colored apron over a plain blue dress. She was the cafe worker. She carried a small yellow cloth and a spray bottle in one hand. She was perhaps in her late 40s, with a kind, open face that showed the gentle lines of a life spent smiling more than frowning. Her hair, a soft brown streaked with gray, was pulled back in a simple, practical ponytail. There was nothing of the artist about her. Her hands, as she set down her cleaning supplies, were capable-looking. The hands of someone who worked, who washed dishes, wiped tables, and lifted heavy trays. He watched, intrigued, as she didn't just swipe at the dust. She treated the old piano with a quiet, familiar respect. She carefully moved the handwritten sign, sprayed her cloth, and began to wipe the lid. Her touch was not that of a cleaner dusting a piece of furniture, but of someone tending to something familiar. She polished the broad, flat surface in slow, circular motions, her expression distant, lost in thought. Then she lifted the lid, propping it open with the worn stick that was slightly too short. She leaned in and gently ran her cloth along the tops of the yellowed keys. Between them, her fingers brushing against the ivories with a feather-light touch. For a moment she paused. Her right hand hovered over the middle C. Then, with a single finger, she pressed it down. The note sounded in the cozy room a little flat, a little tinny, full of the piano's age and history. It was not a beautiful sound by concert standards, but it was an honest one. She listened to it fade into the cafe's murmur, a faint, private smile on her lips. It was a smile of recognition, of memory. Then, as if remembering her task, she closed the lid softly, replaced the sign, and gathered her cleaning things. Something stirred in Victor. A whimsical impulse, born from his weariness and his longing for something unscripted. Here was a person who clearly felt some connection to this old box of wires and wood. Maybe she played. Maybe she knew a few chords, a simple song learned as a child. The idea of hearing something in this place, from someone who played just for the love of it, with no critics listening, felt like a sip of water in a desert dot. As she turned to leave, he spoke. His voice was softer than his stage voice, a little rough from travel. "Excuse me?" She turned, her expression politely questioning, ready to take an order or answer a question about the pastries. He gestured with his chin towards the piano. "Do you play?" he asked. "For fun, perhaps?" The woman her name tag said, Ilara, looked genuinely startled, as if he had asked if she could fly a spaceship. A faint blush crept into her cheeks. She shook her head quickly, clutching her cleaning cloth to her apron. "Oh, no. No, sir. I look after it. Keep the dust off." Her voice was warm and melodic, with a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "Please," Victor said, and he meant it. He offered a smile that was meant to be disarming, tired at the edges but sincere. "I have been listening to very serious music all week. I would love to hear something from this piano. Something simple. Anything." Ilara looked from him to the piano and back again, her discomfort clear. She saw a well-dressed stranger, probably a businessman or an academic, making a polite, quirky request. She didn't see the famous pianist. She saw a customer to be humored. "Really, I'm not a player," she insisted, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a secret. "I might break it, and I have tables to see to." But Victor was persistent in his gentle way. He leaned forward slightly. "I am just a tired man having a coffee," he said, which was, in that moment, the truest thing about him. "The sign says, for pleasure. It would give me pleasure. A single tune. No one will mind." He glanced around the half-empty cafe. A student typing on a laptop, an elderly couple sharing a slice of cake. No one was paying them any attention. He saw the conflict in her eyes. There was a war between her natural desire to be helpful and a deep, almost fierce reluctance. Finally, with a small sigh that was more nervous than annoyed, she relented. "One song," she said, her voice firm. "Only one. And it will not be very good." "That is perfect," Victor said, settling back in his chair. He took another sip of his cooling espresso. His curiosity piqued. He prepared himself for a halting rendition of Chopsticks, or a folk melody played with one finger. He was ready to be charmed by its simplicity, to thank her, and to carry on with his quiet, anonymous afternoon. He expected a small human moment. He was not, in any way, prepared for what was to come. The woman, Ilara, stood by the piano for another moment, looking at it as if it were a large, sleeping animal she was afraid to wake. She wiped her hands, which already smelled of lemon polish, nervously on her apron. Then, with a slow breath that seemed to steady her, she walked back to the old stool. It gave a little squeak of protest as she sat down. She just stared at the keys for what felt like a long time. The black and white pattern seemed to hold her complete attention. In the quiet of the cafe, the only sounds were the soft bubbling of the coffee machine and the gentle tapping of the student's keyboard. The elderly couple had paused their conversation and were watching with mild, polite interest. Victor waited. He saw the tension in her shoulders. He had seen this 1,000 times before in Masterclass's The Fear, before the first note. But this was different. This wasn't the fear of a student about to be judged. This felt deeper, more private, like someone about to open a diary they had kept locked for years. Finally, she lifted her hands. They were not the long, slender hands of a concert pianist he was used to seeing. They were strong, capable hands. The fingers were capable, but they showed the signs of a life of physical work. There was a slight roughness, a practical strength to them. They hovered above the keys, uncertain, like birds unsure where to land. Then, with a deliberate slowness, she placed her right thumb on middle C. She played a single note. Then another. It was the beginning of a scale, but it was hesitant, each note separate and careful. C, D, E. The sound was thin and a little off on the old piano, but clear. She stopped, cleared her throat softly, and let her hands fall back into her lap. She glanced over at Victor, a look of apology in her eyes, as if to say, asterisk, see? I told you. Asterisk, he gave her a small, encouraging nod. He didn't want to pressure her, but he was strangely committed now. He wanted to hear the song she would choose. Please, he said again, his voice just above a whisper. Just something you know. She turned back to the piano. This time, she didn't start with a scale. She settled her left hand lower down on the keyboard, finding a simple chord. It was a basic C major chord, and she held it, letting the slightly jangling sound of the old strings fill the space. Then her right hand began to pick out a melody. It was a folk tune. Something very old and simple. Victor recognized it vaguely. It was a melody from this region, a song often sung at harvest times or in village squares. It was the kind of music that existed in the soil and the air, not in books. Her playing was, as she had warned, not technically skilled. Her timing wavered a bit. Her fingers sometimes stumbled, hitting two notes together when she meant to hit one. The phrasing was simple, almost childlike. But as she went on, something began to happen. The hesitancy started to melt away, note by note. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was feeling them. She leaned into the sadder parts of the melody, her touch on the keys becoming softer, more tender. When the tune rose into a hopeful phrase, her playing gained a little more strength, a bit more rhythm. It was raw and unpolished, but it was full of a genuine emotion that Victor hadn't heard in a long time. It was music that came from memory, from the heart, not from hours of drilled practice. He found himself listening closely, not with the critical ear of a master, but with the appreciation of a fellow human being hearing a story. He watched her face. Her earlier nervousness was gone, replaced by a look of deep concentration, but also of a strange, sad fondness. She was no longer in the cafe. She was somewhere else. In some memory, this tune was pulling from her. The song was short. It had maybe 3 parts that repeated. As she approached the end, she slowed down. The last few notes were played so softly, they were almost just a whisper of sound against the hum of the refrigerator. Then it was over. Her hands came to rest gently in her lap again. There was a moment of silence. Then the elderly couple broke into light, sincere applause. "Lovely, dear," the woman said with a warm smile. Kilara's head snapped up, as if she'd forgotten anyone else was there. The color rose in her cheeks again, this time from a mix of embarrassment and perhaps a tiny bit of pride. She gave the couple a quick, shy nod of thanks before her eyes shifted back to Victor. He was smiling. A real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it. That was beautiful. It had real feeling. She shrugged, looking down at her hands in her lap. "It is just a simple song. From when I was a girl. The simple ones are often the best," Victor replied. He felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was exactly what he had craved. A real moment, an unprofessional, heartfelt bit of music. It was a gift. He felt his weariness lift just a little. He decided he would finish his coffee, thank her again, and slip back out into the misty afternoon, his spirit quietly refreshed. Alara stood up from the stool. The performance, such as it was over. She had humored the nice, insistent stranger. She smoothed her apron and gave him a small, polite smile, ready to return to her work, the tables that needed wiping, the cups that needed collecting. Victor picked up his espresso cup to take the last, now cold sip, but Alara didn't walk away from the piano. She stood beside it, one hand resting lightly on its scuffed wooden side. She was looking at the keys, but her gaze was turned inward, far away. The shy cafe worker was gone. In her place was a person wrestling with a ghost. The brief connection to the music, to the act of playing, had opened a door inside her, a door that had been locked and bolted for a very, very long time. Victor paused, the cup halfway to his lips. He saw the change in her posture. He saw the distant look in her eyes. He slowly set his cup back down on the saucer, the gentle clink sounding loud in the sudden quiet. Without a word, without looking at him or anyone, Alara sat back down on the squeaky stool. This movement was different. It wasn't hesitant. It was decisive. She straightened her back, rolled her shoulders once, and took a deep, slow breath that seemed to fill her entire frame. She lifted her hands again, but they were not the nervous, hovering birds from before. They were calm, sure, and poised. They hovered over the keys with an authority that was utterly new. They were the hands of a completely different person. Victor felt the air in the cafe change. The student looked up from his laptop. The elderly couple paused, their forks hovering above their cake. Then she began. It was not a folk tune. Her left hand came down in a powerful, rolling wave of deep, thunderous chords that seemed far too big for the small cafe. They echoed in the space, a dark, beautiful storm. A split second later, her right hand answered with a cascade of notes, a melody so heartbreakingly sad and soaringly beautiful that it stole the breath from Victor's lungs. He knew this music instantly. It was Rachmaninoff, one of the most difficult, emotionally powerful pieces ever written for the piano. And she wasn't just playing it. She was attacking it, wrestling its immense emotion out of the old, out-of-tune upright with a ferocity and a mastery that was absolutely shocking. The simple woman in the apron was gone. In her place sat a virtuoso. The music that exploded from the old piano was not just sound. It was a physical force. It seemed to shake the very air in the small cafe. The first, thundering chords were so deep and powerful that Victor felt them in his chest, a vibration that matched the sudden, hammering beat of his own heart. The coffee in his cup trembled. It was the second piano concerto by Rachmaninoff. But she wasn't playing the orchestra part. Her two hands were creating the entire world of the piece alone, weaving the soaring string melodies and the pounding brass sections into something that was both impossible and breathtaking on a single piano. And this wasn't a timid reading. This was an interpretation of raw, unleashed passion. Victor Zellner, the world-renowned pianist, sat perfectly still. His body was frozen, but his mind was racing, tripping over itself in disbelief. Every instinct he had as a musician was screaming, "This cannot be happening." The piece was a mountain that even seasoned professionals approached with fear and respect. The technical demands were enormous lightning-fast jumps, intricate fingerwork, chords that required a handspan almost too large for most humans. Yet here she was, in a simple apron, making it look not just easy, but necessary, as if the music had been trapped inside her and was now breaking free. He watched her hands. They were a blur. The strong, capable fingers from moments before were now possessed of an impossible agility and strength. They flew across the keys with a precision that was almost violent in its beauty. The loud, powerful sections shook the floorboards. The soft, tender passages were so quiet and delicate, they felt like secrets being whispered directly into his ear. The old, tinny piano was being pushed to its absolute limits, and under her command, it was transforming. Its imperfections, the slight buzz on a low E, the faint rattle of a loose panel, somehow added to the emotion, making it sound ancient, true, and heartbreaking. He looked at her face. All the shyness, the reluctance, the quiet kindness was gone. Her expression was one of fierce, almost painful concentration. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point on the wall, seeing nothing in the room. She was somewhere else entirely. In that place of memory, of loss, of a story he could not yet know. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek, but she didn't seem to notice. She was one with the music, completely consumed by the storm she was creating. The other people in the cafe were statues. The student had pushed his laptop aside, his mouth slightly open. The elderly couple held each other's hands tightly on the table, their eyes wide with wonder. The barista had come out from behind the counter and was leaning against the doorway, a dish towel forgotten in her hands. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. They were all witnesses to a miracle they couldn't understand. Victor's professional mind began to analyze, even through the shock. Her technique was flawless, but old-fashioned. It was a style from a different era, from the great Russian school of playing. The way she shaped certain phrases, the particular weight she gave to her left hand, he had only seen that in grainy black and white videos of masters from half a century ago. It was a way of playing that was almost extinct, and the emotion. That was the most shocking part. Concert pianists, himself included, spent years learning to convey emotion, to interpret the composer's intent. What poured from Ilara was not an interpretation. It was a direct transfusion of feeling. This was not Rachmaninoff's longing and triumph. It was her longing, her triumph, her sorrow. The music was simply the language she was using to speak it. He had never heard anything so utterly personal, so devastatingly true. In any concert hall in the world, the piece built and built, climbing towards its famous aching climax. Her body moved with the music, not with dramatic flair, but with the natural motion of someone completely immersed. She leaned into the keys. She pulled back. She swayed slightly. The squeaky stool groaned under the shifting weight. The final cascading runs before the last, resolute chords were played with a speed and clarity that made Victor's own fingers twitch in sympathy. It was inhumanly good. Then she reached the end. The final majestic chords rang out, one after another, powerful and full of a hard-won piece. She held the last one, her foot firm on the sustain pedal, letting the sound bloom and then slowly fade into silence. The silence that followed was even louder than the music had been. It was a thick, profound quiet. The normal sounds of the city outside were gone. The refrigerator's hum seemed to have stopped. For a long moment, no one made a sound. The spell was too complete to break. Alara's hands lowered slowly from the keys and came to rest, palms down, on her knees. Her head bowed. She took a deep, shuddering breath, as if surfacing from a deep dive. The fierce concentration on her face melted away, leaving behind a look of profound exhaustion and something else, a kind of shy vulnerability, as if she had just revealed her naked soul to a room full of strangers and was now waiting for their reaction. The elderly woman was the first to move. She brought her hands together in a slow, deliberate clap. Not loud, but filled with awe. It was like a signal. Her husband joined in. Then the student began to applaud, vigorously. The barista clapped, her face split into a huge, astonished grin. The applause was not the roaring standing ovation of a concert hall. It was quieter, more intimate, but somehow more powerful. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated wonder. Ilara flinched at the sound, as if it physically startled her. She looked around, blinking, her eyes coming back into focus on the room, the people, the tables. The color rushed back into her face, a deep red of embarrassment and shock. She was back. The simple cafe worker had returned, but she could not hide what had just happened. She looked, suddenly, like she wanted to disappear into the floor dot her eyes finally found. Victor's. He was still sitting perfectly still at his small table. He had not applauded. He could not. His hands were frozen on the tabletop. All the weariness, the headache, the cynicism was gone, earned away by the fire of her performance. He was looking at her not with polite thanks, but with utter, life-altering astonishment. Their eyes locked. In her gaze, he saw a flash of fear, a plea. It was the look of someone whose deepest secret had just been exposed. Slowly, Victor pushed his chair back. The legs scraped softly on the wooden floor. He stood up. He didn't approach her like a fan or a fellow musician. He walked toward her with a kind of solemn respect, as one might approach a holy place. He stopped a few feet from the piano. The small, warm applause from the others trickled off. Sensing that this moment was between the two of them, the air was charged. You could have heard a pin drop. Victor searched for words, but the ones he normally used, brilliant, masterful, extraordinary, felt cheap and hollow. They were words for performances. What he had witnessed was not a performance. It was a revelation. He finally spoke, his voice rough, barely more than a whisper that still carried in the silent room. "Who?" he asked, the question trembling with genuine awe. "Are you?" For a long moment, she just looked at him. The applause had faded completely, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The shock on her face was being slowly replaced by a deep, weary sadness. It was the look of someone who had been found after hiding for a very long time. She didn't answer his question. Instead, she slowly stood up from the squeaky piano stool. Her movements were stiff, as if the music had taken all her energy. She kept her eyes down, looking at her hands. She flexed the fingers slightly, then closed them into loose fists, as if trying to hide them away again. I should get back to work," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. It was the warm, melodic voice from before, but now it was flat, drained. "Please," Victor said. He didn't move to block her path, but his voice held a gentle command that made her pause. He wasn't the tired stranger anymore. He was a man who had just seen a miracle and needed to understand it. "Please, just sit for a moment. With me." He gestured back to his small table in the corner. It felt like the only private space in the world now. The other people in the cafe, the student, the couple, the barista were all pretending not to stare, but the air was thick with their curiosity. They were giving space, but they were listening with every fiber of their being. Ilara hesitated. She looked from him to the piano, to the door leading to the back kitchen. An escape route. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the bottom of her soul, she gave a small, defeated nod. She walked over and sat in the chair opposite him, perching on the edge as if ready to flee at any second. Victor sat back down. He pushed his cold, forgotten espresso cup aside. For a few seconds, they just sat in silence. The only sound was the soft, returning hum of the refrigerator. "That," Victor began, choosing his words with immense care, was not someone who just cleans the piano. He tried a small, disarming smile, but his eyes were still wide with the echo of the music. A faint, pained smile touched her lips. "No," she admitted quietly. She folded her hands neatly on the table in front of her. They were quiet again, the instruments of a storm now at rest. "Where did you learn?" he asked. "That technique? It is from another time. It is magnificent." She looked out the window at the misty street. The gray light softened her features. "A long time ago," she said, her voice distant. "And far away from here." She paused, gathering her thoughts, wrestling with the decision to speak. "I was a child. In the East, my family. They were not musical, but they said I could sing before I could talk. I would hum along to the radio, perfectly in tune. When I was 6, they found an old broken piano in a community hall. I sat down and I just knew where the notes were. I could play the songs I heard." She spoke slowly, her accent becoming a little more pronounced as she slipped into the memory. "It was a gift," they said. "A miracle. So they saved. They sacrificed everything. They got me a teacher, then a better teacher. By 10, I was at the special music school. By 14, I was at the conservatory." She said the word conservatory with a capital letter, a place of both reverence and weight. Victor knew exactly what she meant. The Moscow Conservatory. The fierce, pressure cooker world of Soviet-era musical training. The most competitive, intense environment on earth for a young pianist. His heart ached for the child she was describing. "It was your whole life," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "It was the only thing." She nodded, still looking out the window. Practice from 5 in the morning. Schoolwork, more practice. Theory, history. There was no room for anything else. No friends, not really. No games, just the piano. And the fear? The fear? She finally looked at him. Her eyes were deep pools of memory. The fear of not being the best. Of disappointing your teachers. Of wasting your gift. Of letting down your family, who had given up everything. It was not about love of music anymore. It was about perfection. It was about winning. Every lesson was a battle. Every performance was a test you could fail. She shook her head slowly. The music, it became a cage. The very thing I loved most became the thing that trapped me. Victor listened, a knot forming in his stomach. He knew this world. He had lived a version of it himself, though perhaps not as severe. He had felt the cage, but he had chosen to live within it, to master it. She had chosen something else. "What happened?" he asked softly. "My family," she said, and her voice grew even quieter. "Things became difficult. There was turmoil. We had to leave, quickly, in the middle of the night, with only what we could carry." She looked down at her hands. "It was a terrible, frightening time. But for me, in a strange way, it was also a release. It was an escape. When we came here, to this country, we were safe, but we had nothing. I had to work. We all had to work to survive." She looked around the cozy cafe, a place she clearly cared for. "I found this job. It was quiet, simple. No one knew who I was, or what I could do. No one expected anything from me. I could just be a person. For the first time since I was a tiny child, I could breathe." She glanced over at the old piano. "At first, I didn't play at all. For years. I wanted to forget. But then, one night after closing, I was cleaning. And I just opened the lid. I played one note, then another. It didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like an old friend I had been cruel to." She looked back at Victor, her expression open and heartbreakingly honest. So now I play for me. Only for me. Sometimes after work, when the place is empty and dark. Or sometimes on a slow afternoon, just a few notes of a folk song to remember where I came from. It is my private world. My secret, no pressure. No judges, just the sound and the feeling. She gave a small, self-conscious shrug. Until today, when you asked, I played the folk song for you, but then I don't know what came over me. It was as if the other music, the old music, saw the door was open and just rushed out. I could not stop it. Victor was silent, taking it all in. The story was not just about music. It was about trauma, survival, and the rediscovery of a pure love. He understood now. The shocking technique was the ghost of her past. The overwhelming emotion was the pain and the peace of her present, all pouring out together. You have one of the greatest gifts I have ever heard, he said, his voice thick with feeling. The world should hear you. A flash of something like fear crossed her face. She shook her head firmly, decisively. No, that is the one thing I will not do. That world, the concerts, the critics, the recordings, the travel. That was the cage. This, she said, gesturing to the cafe, to the simple tables, to the old piano, this is my freedom. This is my life. I choose the quiet. I choose the peace. She looked at him, her gaze steady and clear. The music is not gone. It is right here. But it is mine now. Do you understand? Victor looked at her, this strong, humble, astonishing woman who had found a kind of wisdom he had been desperately searching for in luxury hotels and grand halls. He felt a profound sense of shame for his earlier weariness, and a deeper respect than he had felt for any fellow artist. He nodded slowly. I think, he said, I am beginning to. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with understanding instead of shock. Victor slowly finished his cold espresso, the bitter taste fitting the solemn, beautiful mood. He looked at Elara, who seemed to be settling back into her own skin, the storm inside her having passed. The secret was out, but in this quiet corner, it felt safe. May I ask one more question? Victor said, his voice gentle. She nodded, a little wary but willing. The piece you played, the Rachmaninoff. Why that one? After all these years? She thought for a moment, her eyes drifting to the rain-streaked window. It was the last big piece I was learning before we left. I had struggled with it for months. My teacher said I played the notes, but not the soul. He said I was too young to understand its sorrow. A faint, sad smile appeared. I think I was saving it. All these years I was learning the sorrow. So today, when it came out, it was finally ready. Victor felt the lump in his throat. He understood perfectly just then. A soft click came from the student's table. He'd been so captivated, he'd forgotten his phone was propped against his water glass, recording a lecture. The red recording light was still on. He fumbled with it, his face turning bright red. I am so sorry. It was for my notes. I forgot to stop it. I will delete it right now. He looked genuinely distressed. Victor and Elara exchanged a glance. A silent conversation passed between them. Victor raised an eyebrow, a question. Elara looked at the young man's panicked face, then at her own hands. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, followed by a nod. It was a release, a letting go. It's all right, Victor said to the student. Perhaps keep it for yourself, as a memory of a surprising afternoon. The student's eyes went wide with gratitude and excitement. Thank you, I will. I won't share it, I promise. But they all knew in their hearts that a promise like that is hard to keep when you have witnessed magic. Victor stood up. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple cream-colored business card, but he didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the table between them. On it was just his name, Victor Zellner, and a private email address. No titles, no grand institutions. I must go, he said. But this is for you, if you ever wish to talk. About music or about silence. The offer is for life, with no conditions. Alara looked at the card. She didn't pick it up, but she nodded again. Thank you. He paid his bill at the counter, giving the barista a warm smile. As he turned to leave, he paused by the old piano. He reached out and with one finger pressed down the same middle C that Alara had touched. The note rang out, the same slightly flat, honest sound. He smiled to himself, then walked out into the soft gray mist, feeling lighter than he had in years. The video, of course, did not stay private. The student, bursting with the need to share the impossible thing he'd seen, showed his closest friend. That friend showed a cousin who was a musician. Within a week, the shaky, intimate clip showing the back of a woman in an apron, transforming a dusty cafe into Carnegie Hall, was everywhere. The classical music world, always hungry for a sensation, went into a frenzy. Mystery woman stuns world. Is this the greatest piano prodigy ever found? Zellner's astonishing cafe discovery. Reporters swarmed the quiet street. Cameras were pointed at the daily grind. They begged for the name of the piano angel. But the cafe owner, a stout, protective man who thought of Alara as family, simply shrugged. She is a valued employee. She wishes for her privacy. That is all. He became a fortress. Victor, back on his tour, was bombarded with questions at every press conference. His answer was always the same, respectful and firm. She is a remarkable artist who has chosen a private life. We must respect that choice. Her gift is not a public commodity. It is her own. The shock for the public was not just her skill, but her refusal. In a world screaming for fame, her silence was louder than any concerto. It made people think. What is success? What is happiness? The story became about more than music. A month later, a plain envelope arrived at Victor's manager's office. Inside was a note on simple-lined paper in elegant handwriting. Thank you for your kindness and your respect. If the offer still stands, I would like to talk. Not about a concert, but about an idea. A meeting was arranged, not in a fancy office, but in the same cafe, an hour before it opened. The early morning light was clean and clear. They sat at the same corner table. The world will not forget you, Victor said. The video is out there. I know, Alara said. She looked calm, at peace. I cannot unplay those notes, but I can choose what happens next. I have an idea. You spoke of the cage. The pressure on the young ones today. It is worse than in my time, yes. The internet, the comparisons, the need to be perfect and famous at 16. Victor nodded grimly. It is a machinery that eats talent and spits out stress. What if, she said. Leaning forward slightly, there was a small space, just for a few weeks in the summer, where that machinery was turned off. Not a competition, not a masterclass to create stars, but a place to remember why you started. A place where you could play a folk song without shame, or wrestle with Rachmaninoff without fear of a grade. A place where the soul of the music comes first. Victor felt a spark ignite in his chest. A retreat. Yes, not big. Maybe 10 students. In the countryside. We could call it the first note, focusing on the feeling before the technique. On the story the music tells. She paused, gathering courage. I could not do it alone. The world does not know me, but they know you. If you were there, they might come. And you understand the cage? You feel it too. Victor didn't need to think. It was the most perfect healing idea he had heard in decades. I would be honored, he said. But you would teach. You would have to play for them sometimes. To show them. She took a deep breath. This was the bridge between her private world and the public one, and it felt like a bridge she could cross on her own terms. I could do that. For them. Not for an audience, but for them. And so, the first note was born. That summer, in an old farmhouse surrounded by hills, 10 gifted, anxious young pianists arrived, confused by the lack of schedule and rules. The first day, Victor spoke about weariness. Elara, hesitant at first, simply played them the old folk tune from the cafe. She played it with the same simple emotion. She told them about the cage, and about the quiet joy of playing for an old friend in the dark. It was not an instant transformation. But slowly magic happened. A boy who only played furious, fast pieces tried a slow, sad lullaby. A girl who was terrified of wrong notes played a duet with Elara on the old, out-of-tune farmhouse piano, laughing when they stumbled. Victor found himself talking, less about phrasing and more about the heartbeats, hidden in the silence between the notes. A final night. There was no formal concert. They lit lanterns in the garden. Each student played one piece, not for judgment, but as a gift to the group. The last to play was Elara. She played the Rachmaninoff again. This time it was different. The sorrow was still there, but woven through it was something new. A thread of hard-won peace, and a gentle, soaring hope. When she finished, no one applauded. They just sat in the lantern light, some with tears on their faces, understanding music in a way they never had before. Months later, the famous Victor Zellner gave a rare interview. The reporter finally asked the question on everyone's mind. Will she ever perform for the world? It seems such a waste. Victor smiled, a genuine, calm smile. The world thinks the highest purpose of a gift is to be displayed. She has taught me, and a few others, a different lesson. The highest purpose of a gift is to be lived, to let it heal you, and then to use that healing to help others find their own way. She is not hidden. She is where she has always been, and her music is more alive now than it ever could have been on a stage. Back at the daily grind, on a Tuesday afternoon with no cameras, the old piano sat in its corner. The sore customer's pleasure sign was still there. As the last of the evening light faded, 2 figures sat at it, side by side on the bench. Elara played the low, rumbling bass line of a simple jazz standard. Victor, with a lightness in his fingers he hadn't felt since he was a boy, improvised a melody over the top. They played quietly, for no one, smiling at their mistakes. The greatest shock, it turned out, was not the discovery of a genius. It was the quiet realization that sometimes the most beautiful music happens not in the spotlight, but in the sacred, simple space where 2 souls meet in the joy of a shared tune, finally free.